Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of MidWeek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Hi there, and welcome to our Mill Creek Foursquare Church Midweek podcast. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Trevor, and this is going to be the first in our in a two-part series of Q&A episodes. We've received a number of questions from our congregation, questions that have come in online, through email, through various portals, and also even questions that have been articulated here and there in person after a sermon in the context of a worship service, that kind of thing. And so we've gathered a number of these questions, and in these two final episodes in our Revelation series on the podcast, Trevor and I are going to do our best to respond to some of these questions in ways that are hopefully helpful, bring some clarity, and perhaps also not only bring clarity to some of these specific questions, but also hopefully bring certain themes that we've discussed throughout the podcast and throughout the sermon series to a helpful sort of conclusion.
We've given the people a voice.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And yeah, we should say right off the bat, some of these questions are just excellent questions. And that's always, certainly in my role as a teacher, I am often very encouraged by really thoughtful, really good questions, because it just shows that people are reading texts carefully, thinking theologically, thinking deeply about faith and life and how the scriptures inform those realities. So why don't we just jump in and get started? So Trevor, the first question is a bit of a doozy. It's a bit of a hard one. But we received some really thoughtful questions about one of your sermons in November. You were talking about Revelation chapter 19, near the end of the book, and the Battle of Armageddon, and much of your sermon was focused on aspects of the portrayal of Jesus in that passage. And one of the things that you really emphasized was the way that while some of the imagery in that text can be a little bit sort of off-putting, maybe, to say the least, when we read it closely, you suggested that actually the emphasis in the text is on the words of Jesus and on him conquering through the laying down of his life on the cross, as opposed to just sort of, sweeping in and
him coming
wiping
to slay
everybody
everyone with
out
a sword
in a sort of straightforwardly vindictive kind of way. The question, though, was a really good one. There was a question that was posed that was basically kind of wanting to understand you're suggesting that Jesus isn't sort of primarily interested in just sort of wiping people out in a straightforwardly violent way, but that there's something else going on here. And yet the questioner pointed out that there are a number of places, not only Revelation 19, but there are other places throughout the book that do seem to portray Jesus as embodying the wrath of God in some significant way, as sort of coming in judgment, and even with sort of violent imagery, language, and symbolism associated with violent action. And so the question, which I'm taking a long time to articulate here, but the basic question was, can you clarify what you were trying to articulate in that sermon? And are you saying, or were you trying to say in that sermon that there isn't actually any wrath or judgment? Or how should we understand the sort of portrayal of Jesus in that way?
Yep. Yeah, no, and questions about my sermons are great. We actually have multiple questions about my sermons, so that's always But yeah, to be clear, in the sermon, and I said this in the sermon as well. It was never a matter for me of there clearly is judgment, right? There clearly is a sense of a finality, that there is a place where the buck stops here, right? That we see throughout the entire book of Revelation that the people of God and God himself are witnessing to the words and ways of God, inviting people to turn back. There's that consistent invitation throughout the entire book. But there is a point where you see in the book where the end sets in, right? Where there's this final culminating moment where almost the buck stops here in that sense. And we see that in the Battle of Armageddon. And so I think the best way for me to answer this would be able to even just go back through, because I preached this a while ago. It's been a few months now, is to kind of talk through more of what I said in the sermon. And then we can talk about how this applies, how this almost is an example of our interpretive lens for the entire book and the imagery, any sort of violent imagery or wrathful imagery throughout the book. Now, in Revelation chapter 19, we stepped on the cusp of, starting in verse 11, the Battle of Armageddon. For 3 chapters in the Critique of Babylon, there's this buildup where you see these scenes where the kings of the earth, the people who stand against the words, and the nations standing against the anointed one, the Messiah, consistently get to the bridge of battle, and then nothing happens. The story just kind of moves on. John doesn't feel like going into the battle scene at that point. And so finally we come into the precipice of the end in Revelation chapter 19, and we are told of the one who is on the white horse, the one who is referred to as faithful and true. And we know throughout the book that these words are applied to the person of Jesus. So we're speaking about Jesus here coming on the scene. And as Jesus comes on the scene, we see a shift here, right? It's almost like throughout the entire book, Jesus and the people of God were witnesses to God. They were witnessing to the words and ways of God, asking people to turn. But in this story, it's the witness turned judge. It's the witness. It's almost like a courtroom scene, I would say, in that sense, where we're at a moment here where there's action. There is the hammer in some ways is coming down. But what I challenged was it's not in the way we expect. Because I was even looking up pictures of the Battle of Armageddon online, which is always Googling anything, just kind of going for a cursory search is always a dangerous idea. And the picture is always of Jesus coming down with a sword in his hand. And I showed this one picture in my sermon, but it was Jesus with a sword in his hand, like killing people with the sword, and there's blood. This depiction of this battle has captivated the cultural imagination in many ways. And people have ran with it. Movies have ran with this idea. And so we just have to pay attention to the details in the text. So in verse 13 of chapter 19, we're told of Jesus coming into battle. And the first thing we're told before the battle ever takes place is he is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. And it's such a little thing, but it's such a strange idea because the battle has yet to take place. This is the first time that Jesus is coming on the scene since we heard him speak in the beginning of the book. And he comes on the scene before the battle starts in a bloody robe. It's like watching Avengers or something, and you're at that final battle scene at the entire, the end of the movie, at the precipice at the end. And you've got Iron Man or Captain America or Thor coming on the scene before the battle begins, bloody. It's a strange picture and should cause us to ask questions. Why is this the case? Where did the blood come from? If it's not the blood of his enemies, what blood or where did it come from? And this ultimately points us back to, like we've said again and again, and people are probably getting tired of this, it points us back to the Old Testament story. And this picture of the bloody robe comes from the picture in the book of Isaiah and the prophet Isaiah chapter 63, verses 1 through 6. And Isaiah captures this picture of the divine warrior, this person, this messianic figure who comes on the scene, who brings God's final justice in the world against the people who stand against God's words and ways. But when you read Isaiah 63, it's violent imagery. It's bloody imagery of the day of the Lord. And the blood that comes on the divine warrior is from the people he's bringing justice on, who he's trampling upon, he's bringing justice upon. Yet in this story, so clearly John is making a connection for us to say Jesus is the divine warrior, but not in the way you expect. That the blood on his robe is not the blood of his enemies, but it's his own blood. That ultimately the scandal here is pointing us to the scandal of the cross, as the blood on Jesus' robe is his own, right? It's his own blood. And so this points us to a picture, not of slaughtered lamb turned slaughterer or something like that, but the slain Lamb of God whose blood flows on his robe this is the way, the cross. It's pointing us to ultimately back to that moment of King Jesus' climactic victory on the cross, and that ultimately the blood on himself is his own. And so it points us that imagery. And then we also see, as he comes on the scene, we also see in verse 15 that from his mouth comes a sharp sword, which is to strike down the nations. And so we see a second picture, but notice where the sword comes from. Because every picture I've seen, the sword's in his hand, but the sword clearly comes from his mouth. And this is a picture that draws again from the book of Isaiah of the Messiah. And in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 3 and 4, we're told of the power of the Messiah's words. And so we're being told that Jesus comes to bring judgment, yes, but it's a war of his words. It's not a war of literally him slaying people with a sword, but it's a picture of the announcement that Jesus is king. I mean, I would say in many ways, it's the announcement of what happens when someone announces the good news, right? Someone announces the gospel. Either someone in response to that either finds themselves turning to the good news, right? And turning from their sin to their Savior and being covered by the blood of Jesus, by his own blood, or they find themselves standing in judgment as one who crucified Jesus, right? That they're not covered by the blood. So it creates this tension in the story. And so my whole point of this text was that the imagery here is actually what we've known of Jesus all along. And the predominant picture of Jesus as the Lamb of God, and ultimately points us to this picture of one who is either covered by the blood of Jesus or stands in condemnation by the blood as one who crucified Jesus. It puts us in that tension. And so, and ultimately the picture here in the finals, we end chapter 19, is that no battle ever actually takes place. I had pointed this out in the sermon, but Theologian Michael Gorman, in that classic reading Revelation responsibly that we've been building from, he says this, he says, in Revelation, there are at least 5 occasions in which preparations for a kind of final battle are made, the last of which is the battle of Christ and the white horse, marked by his own, not his enemy's blood. At this battle, as in all the other battles, however, no actual fighting occurs. As noted above, we learn the fate of the enemies of God, but this is more of a battle summary or report of casualties. To repeat, there is no actual final battle in Revelation. Why? Because the images of battle are supposed to suggest to us that the promise and reality of God's defeat of evil, but they're not the means of that defeat. There's no little battle, no little war of the Lamb for those present at the second coming and join in. In the cataclysmic battle of Revelation 19, what do the heavenly armies do? Nothing. All the actions belong to Christ, and his only weapon is the sword of his word. So in general, right, Gorman's point and then my own point in the sermon was not that there isn't judgment or not there isn't a place where the buck stops here, but that tension of the way Jesus wages war is different than the way the cultural imagination has painted the story. It actually critiques it. It actually, and I don't think we have categories for this. I think this is why we struggle with it, is because John is using some violent imagery here. He's using like the idea of a sword. I mean, no matter what society you live in, a sword is a violent image. Blood, violent imagery. Yet we don't have categories where John can be using imagery of something, but be subverting it at the same time, where he can actually take these age-old kind of pictures that any society would understand about war and violence. And I think we get hung up because we just don't see how John can actually take that actual imagery, use it to tell his story and the vision that he's been given, but actually critique it and subvert it the entire way. And I think we've talked about this, and this in many ways is the critique of the entire book. I mean, so what would be your thoughts around what are the broader interpretive implications of what I've just communicated?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. It's helpful the way that you unpacked some of that. And I think, it fits really well with sort of what you could call the central sort of Christological image of the book, or the central sort of image of who this Jesus is, that is the primary subject matter of the book of Revelation. And that central Christological image comes from the heavenly throne room scene in chapters 4 and 5. And specifically chapter 5, which, as we've talked about, as Chris preached beautifully about, and as we've talked about on the podcast before, there's this powerful image in that context of Jesus being portrayed in a sense as the sort of conquering Lion of Judah, the root of David, this sort of messianic divine warrior who sort of achieves final victory. And yet, when John sort of hears that language, and as readers or hearers, we're perhaps sort of primed to expect a kind of straightforward, victorious ruler type image to kind of take place. What he turns and sees instead is a slaughtered lamb on the throne. And so what's that sort of controlling image, with it, that controlling Christological image in the book, helps sort of pave the way even for the kind of thing we see in Revelation 19 that you've described. It's that the certainty of God's victory is affirmed throughout the book, and yet the victory will not take place perhaps in the ways that one might expect from a human perspective, and it might not even sort of look like the kinds of things that we might expect. And so what I think I hear you saying is that it's not as if we have to sort of choose between, are we going to take seriously the portrayals of wrath and judgment in the book, or are we going to try to kind of explain them away through symbolism or metaphorical interpretations or something like that. Rather, what I hear you saying is that certainly John is affirming this reality of sort of divine judgment as part of the vision he's describing, as part of the theology that he's espousing, that kind of thing. And yet it's a particular kind of victory. It's a particular kind of judgment, a particular kind of wrath that, if we take it seriously, has implications for our understanding of who God is and what God is like. Right? It's not just sort of violent retribution for retribution's sake. And it's not just sort of straightforwardly vindictive, the type of God who's just offended that people are opposed to him, and so he's going to sort of wipe them out using as much blood as possible. But rather, the judgment of God is portrayed very much, I would say, throughout the Bible, but certainly in the book of Revelation as a whole, as self-sacrificial from God's perspective, and restorative and redemptive. It's oriented toward the redemption of humanity. It's oriented toward the redeeming and restoration of creation. And so I think, in a sense, we should expect that some of the language and imagery and symbolism that might seem sort of straightforwardly violent and even sort of vindictive and retributive, if we look closer, it might actually be reframed in ways that cause us to, if we look closely, realize, oh, he's not actually holding the sword. Maybe there's something else going on here symbolically and theologically. Or, oh, the blood doesn't seem to be the result of him sort of just wiping people out. What if the author is making a kind of a point about the nature of God's judgment? Even this notion of the battle not sort of taking place. And the Gorman quote that you read is a really helpful articulation of this, that over and over in the book, you're sort of, it seems like we're leading toward some battle scene, and then it just doesn't take place, either because the tension is just relieved and the battle doesn't take place, or just fire comes down from heaven and consumes God's enemies, and there's no need for an actual sort of battle thing. But I think even that should sort of point us to an element of the book's theology, which is that in many ways the defeat of evil that we see in the book of Revelation, in a sense, is still awaited in the future, but in a sense has already taken place on the cross. And so, as we've tried to emphasize over and over in this series and in these conversations, it's not as if the book of Revelation only sort of looks toward some far-off future, but rather it looks toward past, present, and future in the way that it unveils God's redemptive purposes. And so at times, aspects of its imagery and symbolism are intended to point back to sort of unveil what was going on in the cross and in the crucifixion, and how it is that discloses God's victory over the forces of evil. It also points toward the present as the people of God participate in that victory here and now, even as they await its final fulfillment. And it also points toward the future as we see sort of the fulfillment itself actually taking place.
Well, and that's so important, because that means the story actually has application for the people of God now. Now, we're not saying that it's not about as well a future moment where Jesus returns, but there's also an applicative nature of that participatory nature of the book that invites us into. So in some ways, when I think of the blood on his own robe, that invites us, I mean, not to die on a cross, but it invites us into the posture of the self-sacrificial love that we know of Jesus, that actually in that his self-sacrifice actually calls something out of people, right? It actually leaves people out of response. Like, how will we respond to the loving kindness that someone's extending me, but also the loving kindness of God in that way? And even the declaration of his words and the sword coming out of his mouth, it shows us the power of the declaration of the gospel, the declaration that Jesus is king, because which is the same thing we see in Acts as we read the story of the early church of how did they turn the world upside down. It was through the declaration of their words, right? We know it wasn't that they went and took Rome and took over the palace and everything else, but it was ultimately that they proclaimed that Jesus was king, and that was the way they turned, and they laid down their lives. And so I think both of those are at work in this story. And so invites us into, as the reader, to be able to say, oh, this actually has meaning for me right now. That yes, I'm not Jesus. Yes, we're not the second coming of Christ, but we're invited into be in the way of our Savior. And I think that's what we've been talking about throughout the book, of the invitation of the book as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I even just to close out that conversation on wrath, I think even if we were to think quite broadly about the book of Revelation, but also the New Testament, and even the Bible as a whole, probably the two most unhelpful approaches to sort of thinking about wrath and judgment in the Bible. One would be to sort of be dismissive of it or try to explain it away because it doesn't sort of fit our modern sensibilities or something like that. But the flip side would be to just sort of almost embrace it in an overly literal and overly sort of eager kind of way that's also not particularly helpful. I think there's a danger in assuming that, the Gospels and some of the letters in the New Testament might portray Jesus as humble and self-sacrificial and sort of bringing about this upside-down kingdom through the giving of his life rather than just sort of taking over and slaughtering his enemies. But then when we get to the end, we finally see what we really want to see, which is a more sort of, at his return, at his second coming, then he'll be the sort of violent, powerful, vindictive kind of warrior that actually just takes charge and that kind of thing. I think we need to be really careful to allow the text to, the book of Revelation, the theology of Revelation, to do that work that you described of actually subverting some of our expectations and insisting, just as Paul does, just as the Gospels do, that the way in which Jesus expresses power, the way in which Jesus accomplishes victory, and as you were just saying, the way in which the followers of the Lamb then participate in that is always through humble, self-sacrificial witness, faithfulness, as opposed to just sort of taking over.
Yeah.
Okay, there was another great question about one of your sermons, and again, it's a fairly
no questions about
one.
Chris's sermons, but you know what? Here we are.
Yeah, and again, this is one that will probably take a little bit of time to kind of tease out a response to, because you preached at one point on a very long section in the book, right? Was it chapters 6 through 16?
Yep, I did an overview as well as preaching chapter 11 in the same sermon. Should have made that should have been a two-parter.
Yeah. Hindsight is 2020, right? Or 2021 maybe? Anyway. But in that sermon, obviously you were trying to cover a lot of material and so you were giving a kind of overview. But one of the things that you tried to do that I think was helpful is to just signal, as much as there's a lot going on in these chapters, there are ways of thinking about the structure of these chapters that can help us to sort of grapple with what the text is trying to communicate. And you suggested that instead of thinking about these chapters, or really the entire book, as kind of a chronological sequence of events, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, you suggested that it could be helpful to think of it as 3 sets of 7, and 3 sets of 7 that are intended not as sort of sequential or chronological, in order, but rather kind of 3 sets of 7 that each tell the same story, but from these 3 slightly sort of different perspectives. And there were some questions that were just asking for clarity on that, which is completely understandable because it's just a difficult sort of concept. But would you mind sort of unpacking what exactly you're suggesting in terms of how to understand this middle portion of the book and why it's important, why it's a valuable interpretive framework?
Yeah, this is like my time on Oprah or Ellen or something, right? Where I get to just kidding. But no, I know there were questions. One of the challenges of this sermon or any text in Revelation is we wrestled with time more than I think I've ever have in my preaching career, is wrestling with trying to boil this thing down. I remember the first time I practiced that given sermon, it was about an hour and 20 minutes. And I was like, yeah, that's never going to fly, And I was like, honey, what do you think? And she's like, yeah, you should just cut half of it, I was like, okay. So I ended up cutting the entire section on my reasoning of why we interpreted the 3 sets of 7 in this way. I had an entire section. So that's mainly what I want to talk about. But before we get into that, I just want to clarify, there are the broader approaches to it, and then we can get into why we approached it this way for myself, but also the teaching team, because this is the way we approach the book in general as we preached it. There are 2 main general approaches to the 3 sets of 7. So in Revelation chapters 6 through 16, we call it the 3 sets of 7. So there's the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. And there's some interludes in there, so it's not this clean, but basically there's 21 sort of events in the middle that kind of make up the section with some interludes and such about worship. And there's 2 very broad ways to approach a section. The first is to see this as a literal sequence of events. So almost 21 signs to the end kind of thing.
Sure.
Now, some people interpret this as a past reality. So that would be something that happened in history, maybe in the 1st century. These are 21 signs that already took place. Some interpret this as we're in the middle of this. So some of the prophecy YouTube thing right now, like here's how we're in the middle of these 21 signs that are unfolding, and I can tell you exactly where we are or something. And some people say it's about the future, right? These are 21 signs and here's kind of what we can guess will happen, and we'll know when we're in the midst of these 21 signs or something. Now, all of those approaches, in many ways, I would say are similar approaches. I would call them maybe the newspaper approach or the this is that approach to reading Revelation. Because whether it was in the 1st century or now or in the future, someone could pull open I guess newspapers are bad examples. They could open BuzzFeed on their phone or something.
We don't really use those anymore,
They could open, the BuzzFeed on their phone or something or be reading back to the newspaper because it's easier for me. They're reading a newspaper and they could be reading this and see this happened there. So in the 1st century, they'd be looking, they're like, oh, I could see, destruction in temple or something like check off the box. This happened. And we've already spent a lot of time on why this is popular in many ways, why maybe the appeal of an approach like that. But there's definitely a certain, as C.S. Lewis puts it, a chronological snobbery that we apply in this book many ways when we read it in this way. Because there's yet to be a generation who has not thought they were the generation. Now, I'm not here to say whether Jesus is coming back tomorrow or not. He's going to come like a thief in the night, so no one knows the time or day. Yet, there is this proclivity in every generation to think we are in the end. And we've already talked about how, in one way, every generation has been in the end since the death and resurrection of Jesus. So that is the point of the book. But like a literal, these are the events, these are the signs of the times. Now, the other way to approach this section, which is we have talked about, is more as a cycle, is seeing these 3 sets of 7 as 3 different perspectives on what regularly happens between what we've called the now and not yet. So much the trumpets and the seals and bowls each tell their own story in almost the same story, though, from 3 different vantage points. So it functions less like a newspaper and more like a cycle in nature. And in many ways, it portrays phenomena that are the regular commonplaces of human history, wars, famines, economic collapse. And though Revelation portrays it as cosmic scale, we've already talked about much. This is highly symbolic imagery, this apocalyptic literature. It's unveiling heaven and letting us see. So in many ways, it applies to this cycle of what happens throughout history. Now, there's a few reasons we propose to read it this way. And there's certain clues within the text that when you actually read it and pay attention to them, it alludes to why we read it in this way. So one important first thing you see is that the 3 sets of 7, each of them come out of the other. So there's overlap. So there's overlap between the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, between all of them. in many ways, they're like nesting dolls. So, the first set of 7 takes place, and then there's an overlap to the next set of 7, and the nesting doll comes out of it, right? And so literally, because there's such overlap between them, it would kind of signal to us that there's something more happening than a literal sequence of events taking place in the story. Secondly, we see there's also tons of crossover in the imagery themselves. So both the trumpets and the bowls present their events in the same order. So the sets of 7 present the same events. There's a little variation, but for the most part, the events are the same. And it's because they're drawing from similar wells. They're both drawing from the plagues in Exodus, the Exodus story with the people of God in Egypt. So in many ways, the latter 2 sets of 7 are essentially maybe 2 sides of the same coin. Also, we see all 3 sets of 7 end in similar ways. And so all of them end with repetitions of flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder and an earthquake, as well as each of them draw from an end. The 7th of each of these draws from an image that will take place at the end of the book of Revelation, at the end of age. And so I'm literally quoting you right now, but it's this picture of less of a sequential buildup, but that the end breaks in again and again throughout the book. That it's not that we start at the beginning and then we finally get to the end, but the end, like a cycle, is breaking in again and again. And so anyways, those are some of our main reasonings. Is just there's a lot of crossover in imagery. They come out of one another, as well as they end in similar ways, and the end breaks in again and again throughout the book. So those are some of the major reasons we interpret this way. Now, I guess it raises the question, though. Why in the world would John, or an author, construct a book this way? Like, we're talking about the literary signals and saying, well, this is why he did it. Or like, this is how we can know this is this kind of secular format. But just what's the point, I guess, from the author to construct something in this way?
Yeah. I mean, it's a helpful follow-up question to ask, because, you were addressing sort of why you as a preacher and why we as a teaching team were sort of gravitating toward this interpretation, why we thought this was a good reading. But it's also helpful to think through, like, why would the book be constructed this way? If we're right in reading it that way, if this is what the author's trying to communicate, what are the implications of that? What is the sort of theological underpinning? Like, what is it that we're meant to sort of understand about this? And I think, obviously there's, one can never sort of know exactly why an author, one can never just get into the mind of an author and know sort of, oh, this is why they did this. Also, we could approach a question like that from a fairly simple perspective and say, oh, well, this was the vision he had, and so he wrote it down this way.
Which we'll talk about more in our next episode more.
But as we've talked about before on the podcast, and as we'll talk about in the next episode a little more fully, if we think about John not just as someone who sort of had a crazy vision, wrote it all down real fast, and then went on with the rest of his day, but as a careful and deliberate author who's crafting this vision report, this apocalyptic prophetic letter in a careful and intentional way, then we might sort of ask thoughtful questions about why would he take these images of angels opening seals, blowing trumpets, and pouring out bowls of wrath and construct them in this kind of way. And I do think, to me, at least one helpful angle on answering that question, or one possible way of thinking about it, it would be simply to note that like so many things in the book of Revelation, like so many things in our scriptures, the reality of God's judgment is something that is so sort of cosmic and eschatological. It's so sort of beyond our regular human categories that somehow God will one day set all things right and bring this entire thing that we often experience as sort of messy and unclear, this life and human history, that he will somehow bring it to its intended conclusion in a way that deals fully and finally with evil, and also brings about sort of fullness and restoration. Like
these are big boulders.
They're so beyond us. And I think often what the scriptures do is, especially when dealing with some subject matter that is so beyond what we can normally just handle in our human rationality and experience, is it comes at the same thing from a number of angles. And And I mean, we do this in all sorts of ways, right? Like this is how poetry often works. Poetry can feel redundant, often because it's wrestling with some reality or with some idea that is a little difficult for us to fully grasp. And so it sort of comes at it from this angle and then from this angle, and it uses this image and then this image, and it might overlap the images, or it might circle back to the same idea but from a slightly different perspective. In many ways, I think that's the kind of thing that's going on in the book of Revelation. It's sort of wrestling with these massively complex and theologically deep and just sort of cosmic and existential realities of God's judgment and God's bringing of all things to their intended purpose. And instead of just saying, well, it's going to happen like this, and then this will happen, and then this, and then it'll be over. Instead of that, it comes at it draws on, as you were saying, this rich tradition of symbolism and history and theological concepts from the Hebrew Bible and brings those into view. And then it recontextualizes those images and uses them for its own purpose and comes at these ideas from all sorts of different angles. And so I think what that does for us is not only does it sort of help us to recognize that we are being, we're being sort of invited into a series of images that present the unveiling of God's ultimate judgment of evil, vindication of his people, and bringing of all things to their intended purpose. It invites us into that from all of these angles, and ultimately, I think what it does, even through that repetition, is fits within the fundamental purpose of the book that we've talked so much about, which is to encourage and call the people to faithful witness, to patient endurance, even as we see the sort of outworking in every generation of what God's judgment, what God's wrath looks like, that kind of thing. It's probably worth mentioning, too, that this framework for interpreting the book, or at least this middle section of the book, is certainly not just sort of a recent invention or something that Trevor just came up with because he was sort of interested in trying a new approach. It has an ancient pedigree in the church. The church father Irenaeus was fond of this kind of approach to the book of Revelation, which is often referred to using the language of recapitulation, the idea that the same sorts of things are sort of happening over and over as opposed to a sort of sequence of events. And many interpreters would gravitate toward this kind of approach.
I wonder if that's what you're saying is beautiful here, especially when you're talking about the relation to poetry and the refrains. I wonder if that's this is me speculating now, this is not, but I wonder if that's a part of the point too, is that these ideas are so ethereal, they seem so weighty, they seem so cosmic, that we almost need to see them from multiple vantage points. It almost needs to be repeated to us like a chorus. Like I think of a chorus of like a song or something. Like the chorus is what you remember. So it's almost like we almost need that chorus to be played on repeat so that we really let that wrestle and settle into our own souls, to be reminded in our hearts and minds. Because I even think of just the weightiness of the call of the people of God in the midst of Revelation to witness martyrdom, losing life. I mean, the tension, it's really hitting on the tension that the people of God feel in the midst of the world. And I wonder if that's why we need that almost played again and again, is that we need to hear this again and again so we're reminded of this central chorus of God's final victory, of God's final restoration.
Yeah, I think that's right. This sort of continual reminder in a number of different ways. Almost like, in symphonies, the composers will often do like variations on a theme, right? So you've got the one sort of fairly simple theme, but then there's variations on it that sort of build in all sorts of ways. And I think too, I mean, you putting it that way jogged my, or sort of made me think of this idea that this is not the first time that the story of Jesus has been told in a similar kind of way, right? The four Gospels can feel, in a sense, can feel redundant, especially when segments of them are sort of have like verbatim agreement and sort of a lot of overlap in terms of either theme or sort of precise language. But part of the affirmation of the church about these four texts has always been that there is something about the person of Jesus as the revelation of God and the story of God bringing about his kingdom in and through the death and resurrection of this Jesus that needs to be told multiple times. Partly perhaps because of what you were saying, that as a sort of reminder of, or a kind of, variations on a theme. Here are 4 different angles from which we as followers of Jesus can understand who he is, what he has accomplished, and what it might mean for us to follow him faithfully. But also it's this idea, it's not just that repetition and variations on a theme, it's also this back to that idea of mystery, that there is something about who Jesus is, there's something about what God has done and is doing through Jesus that we will never just be able to sort of grasp in one succinct statement or one image that just captures the whole thing. Rather, what we need is these multiple sort of angles of vision that give us some sense of like what we can grab onto. But no one gospel author has like the final say that trumps all the others. And no one image in the book of Revelation is just like, well, yeah, this explains everything. Rather, we pore over these texts day after day as individuals, generation after generation as the church, and continually seek to understand who Christ is, what God has done in and through Christ, and what it might mean for us to follow him faithfully.
That's good. Yeah, I almost think, now I'm even thinking broader. Now we're going down the ripples, but I almost feel like that refrain is almost the whole Bible in some ways, right? There's those threads. For some reason, this is what's popping into my head right now, but I think of the Exodus, and that's I'm thinking of it because 2 of the 3 sets of 7 draw from the Exodus story. Yeah. But when you think of the idea of a new Exodus, right? You think of the idea of the people of God being delivered, and that kind of motif and that picture, and how that's picked up again and again throughout the Hebrew Bible. For example, you read Isaiah, and Isaiah is like new Exodus that's taking place, or even as the people of God return to the land. And then you think of how the Gospels build off the idea of Jesus as new Moses and a new Exodus. That picture in Revelation picks this up as well. I almost think those implications of the idea of that repetition would apply to broader biblical theology in general. Is that you see this throughout the whole, from beginning to end, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, that this is who God is.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing that God does.
Yep.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Well, I think we'll stop there, and we'll pick up in the next episode with more questions and more responses and discussion. But thanks for listening. This episode was edited by Tim Machira. It was produced by Dave Sproul, and we had music from Sherry Machira. Take care.
Thank you for joining us. And should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.